By February 1945, the Great Gallery of Schönbrunn was silent. Dust hangs where music once floated, and a single unexploded bomb has torn a jagged hole beside the oval staircase, wedging itself between Gregorio Guglielmi's 1760 ceiling fresco and the floor above. Below, the white and gold Rococo stucco, crystal mirrors and vast carved chandeliers that once blazed with 72 candles now sit unlit, their arms like frozen suns over Schönbrunner Schlossstrasse in Vienna's Hietzing district. When Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach and later Nicolaus Pacassi drew and revised the plans for this imperial summer residence, the palace was conceived as a Baroque Gesamtkunstwerk of power, one of the most magnificent Rococo interiors in existence, a stage for an empire that imagined itself eternal. Tonight, the bomb does not explode, the fresco and chandeliers survive, but in the quiet after the raid, Schönbrunn's sun-yellow facade begins to look less like permanence and more like a question about how long grandeur can resist time. In the early 14th century, long before gilded ceilings and painted allegories claimed the western edge of Vienna, the land that would become Schönbrunn Palace was known simply as the Katterberg Estate. Records from the period, preserved in the archives of Klosterneuburg Abbey, describe a modest agricultural holding, a house, a watermill turned by the Wien River, vineyards climbing gentle slopes, and orchards stretching toward what is now the 13th district of Vienna. The monastery held title to these fields, leasing portions to tenant farmers who worked the soil and maintained the structures. There were no columns here, no mirrored galleries, no frescoed ceilings proclaiming dynastic virtue. Only the quiet industry of water over stone, the seasonal rhythm of harvest, and the muffled sound of hooves on dirt paths that connected the estate to the city beyond. By 1569, the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian II had purchased the Katterberg property, drawn by its proximity to Vienna and its potential as a hunting ground. Contemporary inventories list the acquisition in dry legal language: one house, one mill, stables sufficient for 20 horses, a walled garden, and the surrounding agricultural lands. Maximilian, whose interests extended beyond warfare and statecraft to include botany and natural philosophy, established a menagerie on the grounds, importing exotic animals and rare plants. He commissioned the construction of a modest pleasure chateau, expanding the original house into a residence suitable for brief imperial stays. The estate began to acquire the character of a retreat, a place where the pressures of the Hofburg could be temporarily set aside in favor of leisure and contemplation. It was during Maximilian's tenure that the name Schönbrunn, beautiful spring, entered common usage, derived from a natural spring discovered on the property. Later legend, embroidered by court chroniclers, would attribute the name's origin to Emperor Matthias, who supposedly exclaimed, "What a beautiful spring," upon encountering the water source during a hunt in 1619. Whether this anecdote is historical fact or later invention matters less than what it reveals. From its earliest years, Schönbrunn was being narratively constructed as a place of natural beauty worthy of imperial attention. The spring itself, modest in flow, would later be incorporated into the estate's Baroque water features, its original simplicity subsumed into a more elaborate hydraulic program. The pleasure chateau that Maximilian built and his successors enlarged remained, by later standards, remarkably restrained. Surviving descriptions from the early 17th century mention a two-story structure with perhaps 20 rooms, a chapel, and connecting service wings. The interiors were furnished comfortably, but without excessive ornament. Tapestries covered some walls, carved wooden furniture filled the principal chambers, windows looked out over cultivated gardens where geometric beds alternated with wilder plantings. This was architecture in dialogue with landscape, a building designed to frame views rather than dominate them. The deer park, enclosed by wooden fencing, extended northward toward the Wien River, providing both recreation and a convenient source of game for the imperial table. In the summer of 1683, the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna brought this modest Arcadian experiment to a violent end. As Sultan Mehmed IV's forces encircled the city, Schönbrunn found itself directly in the path of advancing troops. The pleasure chateau was ransacked, its furnishings looted or destroyed, its structures burned. The deer park was trampled, fences broken, gardens torn apart for firewood and fortification materials. When the siege was lifted in September, after the relief forces under Jan III Sobieski broke the Ottoman lines, what remained of Schönbrunn was a scatter of charred timbers, broken walls, and overgrown plots. The site that had served as an imperial retreat for more than a century was now a ruin, its future uncertain. Yet this destruction, documented in post-siege damage assessments compiled by Habsburg administrators, created conditions for something larger. The cleared land, the absence of prior structures demanding preservation, and the strategic location on Vienna's western approach made Schönbrunn an ideal canvas for architectural ambition. In the years immediately following the siege, as Vienna began to rebuild and Habsburg power consolidated after the military victory, Emperor Leopold II turned his attention to the ruined estate. What he envisioned was not a restoration of Maximilian's modest chateau, but an entirely new palace, a summer residence that would, in scale and splendor, announce Habsburg resurgence and challenge the architectural supremacy of Versailles. The tension between what was destroyed and what was planned reveals Schönbrunn's first paradox. A palace conceived in the language of permanence, built on ground that war had proven vulnerable. The hunting lodge had been comfortable, functional, and appropriately scaled to its purpose. The palace Leopold imagined would be none of these things. It would be vast, ceremonial, and explicitly designed to embody political ambition through architectural form. Stone would replace timber, formal axes would replace informal gardens, and the irregular topography of vineyard and meadow would be reshaped into geometric terraces. In the planning documents that survive from the late 1680s, you can see this transformation taking place on paper. Schönbrunn was being reimagined not as a place to live, but as a place to be seen living. Around 1688, Emperor Leopold I commissioned Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach to design a new palace at Schönbrunn. Fischer, then in his early 40s, had trained in Rome and absorbed the theatrical possibilities of Italian Baroque architecture, its capacity to marshal column, vault, and ornament into instruments of political persuasion. His early sketches, preserved in architectural archives and later published in his treatise Entwurf einer historischen Architektur, reveal an architect thinking in monumental terms. The palace he initially proposed, sometimes called Schönbrunn in scholarly literature, was less a building than a topographical argument, a massive complex rising on the hill where the Gloriette Monument now stands, dominating the Vienna skyline through sheer vertical ambition. In Fischer's drawings, terraces cascade down the hillside in theatrical succession, linked by grand staircases and punctuated by fountains. The main palace structure, crowned by a central dome, commands the summit, its projecting wings creating courtyards and spatial hierarchies. Colonnades connect subsidiary buildings, sculptural groups animate balustrades and parapet lines. The design recalls not just Versailles, but also the Palatine complexes of ancient Rome, which Fischer had studied during his Italian years. This was architecture explicitly in conversation with imperial precedent, claiming descent from Augustus and Constantine as much as from contemporary French models. The message encoded in Fischer's elevations was unambiguous. Habsburg Vienna could rival any power, ancient or modern, in architectural splendor. Yet what Fischer drew and what Leopold could afford diverged dramatically. The War of the Spanish Succession, beginning in 1701, drained Habsburg coffers and diverted attention from architectural projects to military campaigns. The ambitious hillside palace remained on paper, a monument to unrealized intention. What was actually built at Schönbrunn between 1695 and approximately 1701 was a much reduced three-winged Baroque residence, constructed not on the hill but on the lower ground where Maximilian's chateau had stood. Surviving construction accounts document expenditures for stone, timber, lime, and labor, but the sums involved were modest compared to the scale of Fischer's original proposal. The palace that rose from these early building campaigns was habitable but incomplete. The central wing, housing principal reception rooms and a limited number of residential apartments, stood perhaps 3 stories high, its facade articulated with pilasters and window surrounds in the Baroque manner. The lateral wings, extending eastward and westward, framed a forecourt but lacked the elaborate decorative program Fischer had envisioned. Stone from regional quarries, Kaiserstein, a pale limestone from Burgenland, and Loreto calc from Lower Austria, provided the structural mass. These materials, readily available and economically practical, gave the facade a warm cream color that would later be overlaid with the distinctive yellow stucco Schönbrunn is known for today. Inside, the rooms remained largely undecorated. Walls were plastered, but not frescoed. Ceilings were flat or simply vaulted, awaiting the elaborate stucco work and painted programs that would come later. The palace functioned as a serviceable residence, suitable for brief imperial visits, but lacking the symbolic weight its exterior suggested. At night, the corridors would have been illuminated by simple candles in wall sconces, their light casting shadows across whitewashed surfaces. The sound of footsteps echoed in half-empty rooms, a reminder that this was a building still waiting for its final purpose. The future Great Gallery, destined to become the palace's ceremonial heart, existed at this stage only as a long room with tall windows facing south, light-filled but mute, its capacity for grandeur still latent. Fischer von Erlach's involvement with Schönbrunn continued intermittently over the following years, but the palace never achieved the form he had initially proposed. His attention turned to other commissions, the Karlskirche in Vienna, the Hofbibliothek, and projects for wealthy aristocratic patrons. The tension between his drawn vision and the built reality became characteristic of Schönbrunn itself, a palace always shadowed by its own unrealized potential, perpetually in dialogue with an impossible standard. Architectural historians, examining Fischer's surviving drawings alongside the modest 3-winged structure that actually materialized, have noted this gap as emblematic of Baroque ambition meeting fiscal constraint. The stones were real. The dream remained architectural fantasy. By the time of Emperor Joseph I's death in 1711, Schönbrunn was functioning as an imperial summer retreat, but remained architecturally unfinished. The gardens were being laid out in French formal style, with parterres and radiating allées, yet the palace itself lacked the decorative richness its role as imperial residence seemed to demand. The building's silhouette suggested permanence, but its interiors whispered of incompleteness. This would remain Schönbrunn's condition until Maria Theresa, inheriting the Habsburg dominions in 1740, brought a different kind of architectural will to the estate. What Fischer's unrealized hillside palace reveals is not failure, but the structural contradiction at the heart of early 18th century Habsburg power, immense territorial ambition supported by an exhausted treasury. The palace that could not be built on the hill became, in its reduced form, a more accurate representation of the empire itself, formidable in appearance, constrained in reality, asserting authority through architectural gestures even as practical limits shaped every decision. In photographs of Fischer's original drawings, now preserved in Viennese archives, you can still see the palace that almost was, vast, impossible, and strangely more honest in its ambition than the compromise that replaced it. When Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg dominions in 1740, at the age of 23, Schönbrunn was still more promising than a palace. Her father, Emperor Charles II, had died unexpectedly, leaving her to defend her succession against European powers who questioned the pragmatic sanction that guaranteed her right to rule. The War of the Austrian Succession, beginning almost immediately, would test both her political acumen and the resources of the sprawling Habsburg territories. Yet, even amid the military crisis, Maria Theresa turned her attention to Schönbrunn, recognizing that architecture could perform political work that armies alone could not. A palace completed and richly ornamented would signal continuity, confidence, and the capacity to command resources, visual arguments for legitimacy at a moment when her legitimacy was under direct assault. In 1742 and 1743, with the war still unresolved, Maria Theresa commissioned Nicolaus Picassi, successor to Fischer von Erlach as court architect, to undertake a massive expansion and redesign of Schönbrunn. Picasso, whose architectural language was less theatrically Baroque than Fischer's and more attuned to the emerging Rococo sensibility, proposed a comprehensive transformation. Construction accounts from these years document expenditures on an unprecedented scale. Stonemasons, stucco workers, painters, gilders, glaziers, carpenters, and laborers drawn from across the Habsburg lands. The palace that Joseph I had left incomplete would, under Maria Theresa's direction, become an imperial stage fully equipped for the performance of dynastic power. The work proceeded in phases, each documented in architects' reports and financial ledgers. The east wing was expanded first, adding residential apartments and audience chambers. A new carriage passage was cut through the ground floor of the central wing, allowing coaches to enter directly into a sheltered courtyard, a practical innovation that also created spatial drama, the transition from exterior forecourt to interior courtyard marked by vaulted stone overhead. Above this passage, on the Piano Nobile, Picasso designed the two great galleries that would become Schönbrunn's ceremonial core. The larger Gross Gallery, the Great Gallery, measuring approximately 43 meters in length and 10 meters in width, and the smaller Klein Gallery, both intended for balls, receptions, and state occasions. The Great Gallery's proportions were calculated for effect. Tall, south-facing windows, each nearly 5 meters high, flooded the space with daylight, while the north wall, punctuated by mirrored surfaces between pilasters, multiplied and reflected that light back across the room. The ceiling, vaulted and prepared for fresco work, rose high enough to make conversation feel both intimate and monumental. A room designed to contain crowds, yet allow individual voices to carry. The floor, laid in pale parquetry, amplified footsteps, creating an acoustic landscape where movement became audible. This was architecture as social choreography, a space that shaped how bodies moved and how power presented itself. By the mid-1750s, more than 1,400 rooms had been integrated into a coherent Baroque ensemble. This figure, cited in period inventories and repeated in modern guidebooks, is somewhat misleading. Many of these rooms were servants' quarters, storage spaces, and functional chambers invisible to courtly life. But the number itself mattered, a quantifiable expression of scale that could be invoked in conversation and correspondence. Schönbrunn was becoming legible not just as a building, but as a statistic, a data point in the competitive calculus of European royal architecture. To say more than 1,400 rooms was to claim a certain kind of equivalence with Versailles, even if the comparison faltered in other dimensions. The palace's exterior, during this period, moved toward the distinctive sun-yellow color that defines it today. The exact composition of this hue, sometimes described as Schönbrunn yellow or Maria Theresa yellow, has been the subject of scholarly and popular speculation. Chemical analysis of historic stucco samples suggests a base of lime plaster mixed with yellow ochre pigments applied in multiple thin layers over the stone substrate. The color was practical, masking the joints between different building phases and creating visual uniformity, but it also carried symbolic weight. Yellow, associated with imperial dignity and the precious metal gold, transformed the entire facade into a luminous surface, a building that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Inside, the decorative program accelerated. Stucco workers, many trained in northern Italy, applied elaborate Rococo ornament to walls and ceilings, swirling acanthus leaves, floral garlands, gilded cartouches, and decorative frames prepared to receive painted panels. The aesthetic was lighter, more playful than the heavy Baroque of Fischer's generation, Rococo's curves and asymmetries replacing the strict geometries and muscular forms of earlier decades. This stylistic shift reflected broader European tastes, but at Schönbrunn, it also marked Maria Theresa's personal imprint. She involved herself directly in design decisions, reviewing plans, approving color schemes, and selecting artisans. The palace was becoming an extension of her will, a physical manifestation of how she understood imperial authority, elegant, ordered, and insistently present. At the center of the Great Gallery's ceiling, still undecorated in the mid-1750s, was a large oval field awaiting its fresco. Picasso's plans indicated the subject, a glorification of the Austrian monarchy, an allegorical program that would locate Maria Theresa within a lineage of virtuous rule. The frescoist chosen for this task was Gregorio Guglielmi, an Italian painter whose work combined technical mastery with a gift for flattering symbolism. Guglielmi's commission, finalized around 1758, marked the final phase of Schönbrunn's transformation from incomplete hunting lodge to completed imperial residence. What had been a room of light and space would soon become a room of light, space, and ideology, a ceiling that argued in paint and plaster for the inevitability of Habsburg rule. By the end of the 1750s, Schönbrunn was no longer a compromise or a postponed dream. It was a functioning palace, fully operational and visually coherent, its gardens extending westward in formal parterres and radiating allées, its facade presenting a unified face to the city. Maria Theresa had achieved what her predecessors could not. She had completed Schönbrunn. But completion, as the coming decades would demonstrate, did not mean security. The palace was finished. The dynasty it housed was about to discover how fragile finished things could be. By 1760, Gregorio Guglielmi had completed the central fresco of the Great Gallery, and the room that had waited nearly 2 decades for its painted sky finally received its allegorical program. The fresco, titled Glorification of the Monarchia Austriaca, occupied the ceiling's central oval, surrounded by stucco frames and decorative borders. At the composition's heart, Maria Theresa and her husband, Franz Stephan, Holy Roman Emperor from 1745 until his death in 1765, were enthroned in idealized splendor, their figures larger than the surrounding personifications and rendered with the kind of dignified repose that Renaissance masters had once reserved for saints. Around them, Guglielmi arranged allegories of the Crown lands, Bohemia, Hungary, Austria proper, and others, each represented by female figures bearing attributes and banners. Above, celestial beings gestured toward the monarchs, as if heaven itself ratified their authority. The visual logic was clear and conventional. Habsburg rule was not merely political fact, but cosmic order, endorsed by virtue, celebrated by the lands they governed, and blessed by divine approval. The fresco's execution demonstrated Guglielmi's skill. The figures were anatomically convincing. Their draperies rendered with attention to weight and texture. The color palette, soft blues, warm golds, rose-tinted flesh tones, harmonized with the white and gold rococo stucco below. Light, entering through the tall south windows, struck the curved ceiling at angles that changed throughout the day, animating the painted figures with natural luminosity. At midday, the fresco blazed. In late afternoon, it softened into shadow and gentler tones. This responsiveness to natural light, carefully calculated by Guglielmi, made the ceiling feel less like a static image and more like a living element of the room's architecture. Beneath the fresco, the Great Gallery's final furnishings were being installed. Carved wooden chandeliers, designed to hold dozens of candles, were hoisted into place and gilded. Period descriptions mention chandeliers with 72 candle arms, their gilded wood branches radiating outward like frozen suns. When lit for evening receptions, these fixtures transformed the gallery into a volume of warm, flickering light, their glow multiplied by the mirrored surfaces on the north wall. The effect, by all contemporary accounts, was overwhelming. A room where light seemed to originate from everywhere at once, dissolving the boundaries between wall, ceiling, and space. To enter the Great Gallery at night, with 1,000 candle flames burning and the mirrored walls reflecting their light back toward the ceiling, was to step into an architectural argument for the permanence and brilliance of imperial power. Yet, even as the Great Gallery proclaimed eternal rule, the rooms of Schönbrunn witnessed mortality. In 1767, an outbreak of smallpox swept through Vienna, striking the imperial family with particular cruelty. Maria Theresa herself contracted the disease. She survived, but her face bore the scars for the rest of her life. Her daughter, Archduchess Maria Josepha, was not so fortunate. At 16, on the verge of a marriage to Ferdinand IV of Naples, Maria Josepha died of smallpox on October 15, 1767. The death occurred at Schönbrunn, in one of the palace's many residential chambers, a room with windows looking out over the gardens, now a site of vigil and grief rather than preparation and anticipation. The juxtaposition was stark. Above, in the great gallery, Guglielmi's fresco portrayed the Habsburg monarchy as an unbroken line of virtuous rule, blessed by heaven and celebrated by its territories. Below, in private apartments, a 16-year-old girl's body was prepared for burial, her planned dynastic marriage dissolving into funeral arrangements. The palace, designed to embody permanence, could not protect its inhabitants from epidemic disease. Architecture, no matter how splendid, remained porous to history's less predictable forces. Maria Josepha's death was not the last smallpox tragedy in Maria Theresa's family, nor was it the only loss to strike the dynasty at Schönbrunn, but it marked an early instance of what would become a recurring pattern: the gap between the palace's symbolic claims and the biological vulnerability of those who inhabited it. The ceiling spoke of order and continuity. The rooms beneath it contained contingency, grief, and the ordinary human fact of death. Visitors to the Great Gallery walking beneath Guglielmi's fresco in later years would have had no way of knowing that smallpox had claimed a young archduchess in a room nearby. The architecture preserved its composed surface, revealing nothing. In an often-quoted description from the 1760s, an anonymous court observer praised Schönbrunn as a palace whose gardens have everything that art has ever created, a judgment that extended implicitly to its interiors. The phrase captures the confidence of the moment, a belief that human design, sufficiently ambitious and well-funded, could create environments comprehensive enough to stand as complete worlds. Schönbrunn, in this view, was not merely a residence, but a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art where architecture, garden design, painting, sculpture, and decorative arts converged into a unified aesthetic and political statement. Yet total works of art remain subject to partial disasters. The smallpox that killed Maria Josepha did not care about Guglielmi's ceiling or Picasso's proportions. Epidemic disease moved through gilded corridors as easily as through peasant cottages, indifferent to the symbolic claims encoded in stucco and fresco. The palace could stage permanence, but it could not enforce it. This gap between the architectural language of eternity and the biological reality of fragility would widen in the decades to come, as Schönbrunn transitioned from newly completed monument to aging stage for a dynasty that would face challenges its builders had not anticipated. 3 sensory anchors defined the Great Gallery in its completed state: the quality of morning light entering through those tall southern windows, striking the crystal mirrors and multiplying across the room; the coolness of the pale parquet floor underfoot, its polished wood smooth and slightly yielding; and the echo of footsteps as servants moved through the space, testing acoustics before the first full court ball. These physical properties, documented in period accounts and preserved in the room's current restoration, constituted the gallery's experiential reality, the way it felt to inhabit the space, as distinct from how it looked in Guglielmi's allegorical program. The chandeliers, hanging between fresco and floor, completed the room as a volume of light. They were not merely functional fixtures, but architectural elements in their own right, their carved and gilded forms asserting decorative presence even when unlit. Later electrified and still later fitted with LED bulbs designed to mimic candlelight, these chandeliers would persist through every subsequent phase of Schönbrunn's history, survivors that outlasted the empire they were built to illuminate. In 1760, however, they were new, their gilding bright, their candles waiting to be lit for the first grand reception under Maria Theresa's completed palace ceiling, a ceiling that promised immortality but could not prevent the ordinary deaths unfolding in the rooms below. In the decade following the Great Gallery's completion, Schönbrunn became the setting for an intensification of Maria Theresa's dynastic strategy, the systematic marriage of her daughters to Europe's ruling houses. The empress had 16 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood, a statistically favorable outcome by 18th century standards, but one that also presented logistical and political challenges. Daughters, in particular, functioned as diplomatic currency, their marriages cementing alliances, resolving conflicts, and extending Habsburg influence through kinship networks that crossed national boundaries. Schönbrunn's newly completed ceremonial spaces provided the architectural backdrop for this process, the Great Gallery and smaller reception rooms serving as training grounds where adolescent archduchesses learned the choreography of court life before being dispatched to foreign capitals. The most famous of these child brides was Maria Antonia, later known as Marie Antoinette, who in 1770, at age 14, was promised to Louis Auguste, the 15-year-old Dauphin of France. The marriage was a cornerstone of the Franco-Austrian alliance forged after the 7 Years' War, a reversal of centuries of Habsburg-Bourbon rivalry. Contemporary correspondence, preserved in Austrian and French archives, documents the meticulous preparations, negotiations over dowry and marriage contracts, orders for trousseau and jewelry, arrangements for the proxy wedding ceremony in Vienna, and the journey to Versailles. Maria Antonia herself appears in these documents as an object of careful curation, her education supervised, her appearance scrutinized, her every gesture prepared for inspection by a French court known for its exacting standards. At Schönbrunn, in the months before her departure, Maria Antonia would have walked beneath Guglielmi's fresco, her footsteps echoing in the Great Gallery, as she attended family dinners and smaller receptions. The chandeliers, newly installed and glittering with dozens of candles, cast warm light on these gatherings, illuminating faces and creating the kind of controlled luminosity that made every participant visible and legible. To be seen under such light was to be evaluated, measured against standards of deportment and grace that governed courtly conduct. For Maria Antonia, these occasions were not merely social, but educational, rehearsals for a life at Versailles where she would be perpetually observed, her every action interpreted as a reflection of Habsburg dignity or Habsburg inadequacy. The departure, when it came, was ceremonial. Maria Antonia left Vienna in April 1770, traveling west in a procession that included multiple carriages, servants, and an entourage carefully selected to accompany her to the French border. At the border, she would undergo the ritual of the remise, the formal handover from Austrian to French custody, including the symbolic act of removing her Austrian clothing and donning French garments, a physical stripping away of old identity and adoption of new allegiance. Schönbrunn, for Maria Antonia, was the last Austrian space where she existed fully as an archduchess before the machinery of dynastic marriage transformed her into the Dauphine of France. The fate that awaited Marie Antoinette, her years as queen, the collapse of the French monarchy, her trial and execution in 1793, has been exhaustively documented elsewhere. What matters for Schönbrunn's history is the gap between the room where she was trained and the scaffold where she died. The Great Gallery, with its allegorical ceiling celebrating virtuous monarchy, prepared her for a world that, within 2 decades, would violently reject the premises that ceiling embodied. The palace taught continuity and hierarchy. History delivered revolution and rupture. Architecture, no matter how carefully constructed, could not control the political forces it was designed to symbolize. Maria Antonia was not the only Habsburg daughter sent into marriages arranged for dynastic advantage. Her sisters, Maria Amalia, Maria Carolina, and Maria Christina, also married into European ruling families, each departure marked by similar ceremonies at Schönbrunn and the Hofburg. The palace functioned during these years as a kind of finishing school for aristocratic femininity, a place where girls barely out of childhood learned to walk, speak, and carry themselves in ways that would be legible to foreign courts. The corridors of Schönbrunn, lined with mirrors and lit by sconces, became spaces of perpetual self-surveillance where young women internalized the gaze that would follow them throughout their married lives. Period correspondence between Maria Theresa and her daughters after their departures reveals the emotional costs of this system. Letters speak of homesickness, isolation, and the difficulties of adapting to foreign customs and languages. Yet the architectural language of Schönbrunn itself acknowledged none of this. The Great Gallery remained a space of light and symmetry, its fresco proclaiming the harmony of Habsburg rule. The private grief of young women sent away from home existed in other rooms, in letters written at small desks, in tears shed in private chambers far from the ceremonial axis of the palace. The chandeliers, burning above court dinners where adolescent archduchesses learned to smile and converse under observation, were artifacts of a specific 18th century understanding that female bodies could be trained into instruments of statecraft, that personal desire could be subordinated to dynastic necessity, and that architecture could create environments where such training felt natural rather than coercive. The Great Gallery did not impose this system. It merely provided the stage where the system performed itself, presenting the marriages of 14 and 15-year-olds as celebrations rather than sacrifices. Yet to walk through Schönbrunn today, beneath the same ceiling and past the same mirrored walls, is to encounter this history uncomfortably. The room is beautiful. Its function was often cruel. The tension between aesthetic splendor and historical suffering cannot be resolved, only acknowledged. The palace preserves its rococo surfaces, but those surfaces once witnessed the preparation of child brides for lives they had not chosen in countries they had never seen, among people who spoke languages they were still learning. The painted sky above remains serene. The human stories beneath it were considerably less so. In one preserved description from the 1770s, a visitor to Schönbrunn noted the extraordinary brilliance of the Great Gallery when lit for evening receptions, the chandeliers creating a second sky of earthly light that rivaled the frescoed ceiling above. The metaphor is revealing. A second sky, artificial and controlled, competing with the painted allegory for visual dominance. Both skies, fresco and chandelier, were human constructions designed to make dynastic power feel celestial and inevitable. But beneath both skies, in the rooms where Maria Theresa's daughters prepared for marriage, the reality was more earthbound. Teenage girls learning to perform roles that history would, in several cases, judge harshly or end tragically. The chandeliers illuminated this process without comment, their light falling equally on celebration and subordination, on painted virtue and lived compromise. In November 1805, French troops occupied Vienna, and Napoleon Bonaparte chose Schönbrunn as his headquarters. The decision was strategic and symbolic. The palace, located beyond the city's western fortifications, offered security and space for the large military staff that accompanied the French emperor. But it also provided Napoleon an opportunity to inhabit the architectural language of his Habsburg adversaries, sleeping in rooms built to glorify the very dynasty he had just defeated. A suite in the East Wing, later known as the Napoleon Room, served as his bedroom during both his 1805 stay and his return in 1809. Period accounts describe it as a relatively modest chamber, paneled in wood and hung with Brussels tapestries dating from the 18th century, its furnishings more comfortable than ostentatious. The room's dimensions, preserved in architectural surveys, measured approximately 6 meters by 5 meters, intimate by palace standards. A large bed, positioned against one wall, dominated the space. Windows looked eastward over the forecourt and beyond it toward Vienna. At night, the room would have been lit by candles, their flames casting shadows across the tapestried walls. The sound of boots in the corridor outside, the muffled voices of aides and officers, and the occasional creak of floorboards under foot traffic, these auditory elements constituted the room's atmosphere during Napoleon's occupation. This was not the Great Gallery's theatrical grandeur, but something quieter and more private, a space where an emperor could retreat from the performance of command. Napoleon's presence at Schönbrunn inverted the palace's symbolic program. Guglielmi's fresco in the Great Gallery still depicted Habsburg virtue and divine sanction. The corridors still bore Rococo ornaments celebrating Maria Theresa's reign. Yet the building now hosted the man who had shattered Habsburg military power at Austerlitz and forced Emperor Francis II to accept a humiliating peace. Architecture, which aspires to permanence, proved immediately adaptable to political reversal. The same windows that had framed Habsburg processions now framed French troop movements. The same chandeliers that had illuminated Habsburg court balls now hung above rooms where French officers planned the occupation of Austria. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed on October 14, 1809, after Austria's defeat at the Battle of Wagram, formalized this humiliation in documentary form. The treaty negotiations took place within Schönbrunn's rooms, Habsburg diplomats meeting French counterparts in spaces designed to assert Habsburg authority. The terms were severe. Austria lost access to the Adriatic, ceded territory to Bavaria and the Duchy of Warsaw, agreed to pay large indemnities, and accepted limits on its military forces. One later, Habsburg commentator, writing decades after the events, called Schönbrunn the final glory and last arena of the monarchy, a phrase heavy with retrospective irony. The palace that embodied Habsburg permanence had become the site of its most definitive 19th-century defeat. Yet, even during occupation, Schönbrunn's ceremonial functions continued. Napoleon, ever conscious of spectacle and legitimacy, used the Great Gallery for receptions and state dinners. The chandeliers were lit, the mirrored walls reflected candlelight, the fresco overhead remained unaltered. French officers and Austrian nobles, now subjects of a reordered Europe, gathered beneath Guglielmi's painted monarchs, the visual and social ironies stacking silently. To stand in that room during those years was to experience architecture's fundamental indifference. The palace did not care who occupied it, so long as its forms could still stage power. An inventory compiled after Napoleon's 1809 departure documents the condition of the rooms he had used. Damage was minimal. Some furniture worn, a few tapestries in need of repair, floors scuffed by boots and spurs. The palace's stone structure and decorative program remained intact. This physical resilience, noted with relief by Habsburg administrators, contrasted with the political damage Austria had sustained. Buildings, it turned out, could survive military defeat better than the regimes that built them. Schönbrunn's walls bore almost no evidence of French occupation, but the monarchy that commissioned those walls had been fundamentally weakened. Napoleon's son, the Duke of Reichstadt, would later die in the same Napoleon room in 1832 of tuberculosis at age 21. He had been born Napoleon II, proclaimed heir to the French Empire, but spent most of his life in Vienna as a Habsburg prisoner guest, his imperial birthright reduced to a nominal title and a watched existence. The room that had briefly housed the conquering emperor became the deathbed of his only legitimate son, the space itself a witness to the reversals and tragedies that architectural grandeur could neither prevent nor narrate. To know that both Napoleon and his son occupied this room, at opposite ends of fortune, is to understand Schönbrunn not as a monument to any single dynasty, but as a stage where multiple dramas of power and loss played out, indifferent to the actors' scripts. The period of French occupation revealed something fundamental about Schönbrunn: its capacity to absorb and reframe political change without altering its architectural language. The palace did not need to be redesigned or rebuilt to accommodate Napoleon. It simply received him, as it had received generations of Habsburgs, offering the same proportions, the same light, the same spatial hierarchies. This adaptability, which might seem like resilience, also marked a kind of emptiness, a building so thoroughly dedicated to the performance of power that it could stage any power, regardless of whose colors flew above its roofs. When the Habsburgs returned to full control of Schönbrunn after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the palace required little physical restoration. Furnishings were cleaned, rooms aired, minor repairs completed. But the symbolic restoration was more complex. How does a palace recover its meaning after hosting the enemy who defeated its builders? The answer, pragmatic and unspoken, was to continue as before. To light the chandeliers, to hold court balls in the Great Gallery, to maintain the gardens and interiors as if the occupation had been a brief, regrettable interruption rather than a demonstration of the palace's fundamental symbolic vulnerability. In photographs taken decades later, the Napoleon room appears much as it did during Napoleon's stays: wood paneling, tapestries, modest proportions. The room is now a museum stop, its historical associations carefully curated in plaques and guided commentary. Visitors are told that Napoleon slept here, that his son died here, that these walls witnessed both imperial ambition and imperial decline. What they cannot see, because architecture cannot make it visible, is the gap between the room's physical permanence and the impermanence of the political orders it served. The bed remains. The empires that sent men to sleep in it have dissolved. The tapestries endure. The meanings they once carried have migrated into museum text panels and historical memory. Schönbrunn, by remaining itself, became something other than itself, not a living imperial residence, but an archive of the multiple ways imperial projects fail. Franz Joseph was born at Schönbrunn on August 18, 1830, in a second-floor room of the East Wing. He would die in the same palace 86 years later, his life bracketed by the yellow walls and Baroque symmetries of the building that served over those decades as cradle, residence, office, and deathbed. This continuity, one man, one building, nearly a century, made Franz Joseph and Schönbrunn inseparable in both contemporary perception and later memory. To speak of the emperor was to invoke the palace. To describe the palace was to recall the ruler whose extraordinarily long reign gave Schönbrunn its most sustained period of human occupation and symbolic weight. Franz Joseph ascended to the throne in 1848 at age 18, amid revolutionary upheavals that shook the Habsburg Empire and most of Europe. His early reign was marked by military suppression of nationalist movements, conservative centralization of power, and a personal style that emphasized duty, discipline, and emotional restraint. Unlike his predecessors, who had divided their time between the Hofburg in Vienna and Schönbrunn, Franz Joseph made the summer palace his primary residence. He preferred its relative isolation and its association with Maria Theresa, whose reign he regarded as a model of effective Habsburg rule. Over the course of his decades on the throne, Schönbrunn transitioned from seasonal retreat to year-round imperial seat, its rooms occupied even in winter, its ceremonies adapted to the rhythms of Franz Joseph's own austere daily routine. The emperor's bedroom, preserved today as part of the palace tour, reveals this austerity with striking clarity. The room measures perhaps 5 meters by 6 meters, its walls covered in simple fabric, its furnishings minimal. A narrow iron frame bed, a small desk, a washstand, a crucifix above the bed. There is no excess, no decorative elaboration beyond what function requires. The bed is barely wide enough for one person, its mattress thin and firm. Contemporary accounts describe Franz Joseph rising at 4 or 5 in the morning, washing in cold water, and beginning work at his desk before most of his court had woken. He ate simply, dressed plainly, and maintained a schedule of relentless bureaucratic attention to state paperwork. The contrast between this private monastic rigor and the public splendor of Schönbrunn's ceremonial spaces is one of the palace's most telling architectural facts. In the Great Gallery, with its gilded chandeliers and frescoed ceiling, Franz Joseph presided over balls, receptions, and diplomatic events that required full court dress and elaborate ritual. But when these performances ended, he returned to a bedroom that might have belonged to a minor civil servant or an ascetic monk. This duality, theatrical excess in public, Spartan restraint in private, characterized both the emperor's personal life and the empire he governed, a structure that presented grandeur externally while operating internally on strict economy and bureaucratic routine. Census-like inventories from the late 19th century document Schönbrunn at its most complete. More than 1,400 rooms, as earlier noted, but now with fuller descriptions: state apartments, private chambers, servants' quarters, kitchens, storage spaces, administrative offices. The palace functioned as a self-contained world, employing hundreds of staff: cooks, cleaners, gardeners, stable workers, guards, secretaries. The gardens extended westward in geometric perfection, their parterres maintained daily, their fountains operational, their allées lined with precisely trimmed trees. Ancillary buildings, the Gloriette on the hill, the Palm House, the Tiergarten Zoo, added layers of function and meaning, transforming Schönbrunn from a single building into a comprehensive landscape. In 1901, the Great Gallery's chandeliers were electrified, their candles replaced with light bulbs. This technological update, documented in palace maintenance records, marked a significant shift in how the room could be used and experienced. Electric light was brighter, more reliable, and safer than candle flame. It also fundamentally altered the room's atmosphere. Where candlelight had flickered and created moving shadows, electric light was steady and uniform. Where candle flame had added warmth and slight haze to the air, electric bulbs produced cooler, sharper illumination. By the early 20th century, more than 1,000 individual electric lights could be lit simultaneously in the Great Gallery, transforming it into a space of brilliant, almost clinical brightness. Photographs from the period show the room in this new, electrified state, its every decorative detail visible with unprecedented clarity. The stucco ornament, previously softened by candle glow, now stood out in sharp relief. The fresco, once modulated by natural and flickering light, became more legible but also more static, its figures frozen under constant illumination. The paradox of preservation through modernization was already evident. To maintain the room's function as a ceremonial space required updating its infrastructure, but each update subtly altered the room's experiential reality. The Great Gallery of 1901 was, in one sense, the same room Guglielmi had frescoed in 1760. In another sense, it was an entirely different space, its fundamental relationship to light transformed by a technology the original builders could not have imagined. Franz Joseph's daily routine, in contrast to these technological changes, remained almost unchanged over decades. He rose early, worked through administrative paperwork, received ministers and officials in scheduled audiences, took a simple lunch, resumed work, attended state functions when required, and retired to his narrow bed at a set hour. This ritualized existence, repeated year after year, gave Schönbrunn the quality of a monastery devoted not to prayer, but to bureaucratic governance. The emperor's life was structured around the palace, and the palace's rhythms were structured around him. Visitors to Schönbrunn during these years often remarked on the eerie quiet of its corridors, thousands of square meters of building, inhabited by hundreds of people, yet pervaded by a sense of stillness and routine that felt almost inhuman in its regularity. Franz Joseph's longest and most significant relationship, apart from his duties, was with Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, whom he married in 1854. Their marriage, initially affectionate, deteriorated over time into a distant coexistence. Elizabeth, famously restless and uncomfortable with court life, spent as little time at Schönbrunn as protocol allowed, traveling extensively and cultivating a public persona as a tragic, misunderstood figure. Her assassination in 1898 by an Italian anarchist in Geneva shocked Europe and deepened Franz Joseph's already pronounced emotional isolation. He continued his routines at Schönbrunn, the palace now even more a site of solitary duty, its grand rooms and private chambers alike marked by absence. By the early 20th century, Franz Joseph had become a living anachronism, an emperor whose style and worldview belonged to the mid-19th century, governing an empire increasingly shaped by nationalism, industrialization, and demands for political reform that his conservatism could not accommodate. Schönbrunn, similarly, was an 18th-century palace operating in a 20th-century world, its ceremonies and aesthetics increasingly out of step with the societies beyond its gates. The emperor's narrow bed and the palace's vast ceremonial spaces suggested a life stretched between duty and emptiness, public performance and private void. The building that was meant to embody permanence now felt more like a mausoleum inhabited by a man who had outlived his era. Crown Prince Rudolf, born at the Hofburg in 1858, was Franz Joseph and Elizabeth's only son, the designated heir to an empire that by the 1880s was straining under internal ethnic tensions, economic pressures, and the diplomatic complexities of a multipolar Europe. Rudolf grew up between the Hofburg and Schönbrunn, educated by tutors selected for their conservatism and loyalty, raised within protocols that treated childhood as preparation for imperial duty. Photographs from his youth show a dark-haired boy with intelligent, restless eyes, standing in a formal pose beside parents whose own relationship was dissolving into mutual estrangement. By his 20s, Rudolf had developed into an intellectually curious, politically liberal, and personally troubled young man, increasingly at odds with his father's rigid conservatism and the court world both palaces embodied. Schönbrunn, for Rudolf, was simultaneously home and prison. He maintained apartments there, attended family gatherings under the Great Gallery's chandeliers, and participated in the ceremonial routines that structured Habsburg life. But contemporary accounts, drawn from his letters and the observations of those who knew him, describe a man who found these rituals suffocating. Rudolph's political views. He favored constitutional reform, closer ties with Hungary, and a more liberal approach to the empire's ethnic diversity, put him at odds with Franz Joseph's autocratic instincts. Their relationship, strained by political disagreement and personal incompatibility, added psychological weight to the architectural spaces they shared. Rudolph's marriage in 1881 to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, arranged for dynastic reasons, quickly became another source of unhappiness. Stephanie, by her own later account, found Rudolph emotionally distant and increasingly erratic. The couple lived at Schönbrunn in the Hofburg, their marriage a public performance of Habsburg continuity, masking private dysfunction. Letters between Stephanie and her family, preserved in Belgian archives, describe Rudolph's mood swings, heavy drinking, and occasional cruelty. The marriage produced one daughter, Elizabeth, but no male heir, a failure that added political pressure to personal misery. By the late 1880s, Rudolph's behavior had become the subject of court gossip and official concern. He was seen at Schönbrunn walking the corridors late at night, attending formal dinners in the Great Gallery where he spoke little and drank heavily, and spending days in his apartments, sometimes emerging only for mandatory appearances. The palace that had once seemed like an architectural argument for dynastic continuity now contained an heir whose presence undermined that argument, a future emperor who appeared increasingly incapable of assuming the role for which his entire life had prepared him. In January 1889, Rudolph left Vienna for Meierling, a small hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, approximately 30 kilometers southwest of Schönbrunn. He was accompanied by Baroness Mary Wetzera, a 17-year-old woman with whom he had been involved romantically. On the morning of January 30, 1889, servants discovered both Rudolph and Mary Wetzera dead in the lodge's bedroom. The immediate official statement, released by the court, spoke vaguely of Rudolph's death from a rupture of an aneurysm of the heart, a medically implausible phrase designed to avoid scandal. Subsequent investigations, both contemporary and historical, concluded that Rudolph had shot Mary Wetzera and then himself in a murder-suicide pact, though the precise motivations and circumstances remain subjects of historical debate. The news reached Schönbrunn by telegraph and courier. Franz Joseph, informed in his modest bedroom, reportedly received the information with outward calm, though later accounts describe his grief as profound and lasting. Empress Elizabeth, traveling at the time, returned to Vienna in shock. The court moved quickly to manage the scandal. Mary Wetzera's body was removed from Meierling in secrecy, buried in a monastery graveyard under circumstances designed to minimize attention. Rudolph's body was brought to Vienna and given a state funeral, his death officially attributed to suicide in a state of mental derangement, which allowed Catholic burial rites. Meierling was immediately converted into a Carmelite convent, the bedroom where the deaths occurred destroyed and replaced with a chapel. The physical site of the tragedy was, in effect, erased, its architecture repurposed to prevent it from becoming a location of morbid curiosity or political symbolism. But Schönbrunn, where Rudolph had lived and where his parents now grieved, could not be so easily transformed. The rooms he had occupied remained, his absence now a presence that haunted the palace's corridors. The Great Gallery, where Rudolph had attended court functions beneath Guglielmi's fresco celebrating Habsburg continuity, continued to host receptions and ceremonies. The chandeliers still burned for state occasions, their light falling on courtiers and diplomats who now discussed the succession crisis Rudolph's death had precipitated. With no male heir, the line would pass to Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a shift that reordered the dynasty's future and added uncertainty to an empire already facing nationalist pressures and geopolitical challenges. Rudolph's death became, in popular and historical memory, one of the Habsburg dynasty's defining tragedies. The mystery surrounding the events at Meierling, the mixture of known facts and unresolvable questions, has generated endless speculation, novels, films, and scholarly investigations. But for Schönbrunn, The tragedy's meaning was more immediate. The palace, designed to embody dynastic permanence, had raised an heir who found that permanence unbearable. The sunlit gallery and the dark lodge at Meyerling were two faces of the same system, one architectural, one human, one designed to represent continuity, the other revealing the costs continuity could impose on individuals trapped within its logic. In later years, visitors to Schönbrunn were sometimes told in hushed tones that Rudolf's ghost walked the corridors, a legend that transformed personal tragedy into Gothic spectacle. Whether anyone actually claimed to see this ghost matters less than the legend's emergence. It indicates how thoroughly Rudolf's death had become woven into the palace's narrative. Schönbrunn was no longer just Maria Theresa's masterpiece or Franz Joseph's residence. It was also the site haunted by the heir who could not fulfill his dynastic role, who chose death over the life the palace and its protocols demanded. The chandeliers in the great gallery, which had illuminated Rudolf's unhappy presence at court functions, continued to burn. But their light now fell on a succession plan altered by suicide, on an emperor who had lost his only son, and on a court that could not openly acknowledge the full circumstances of that loss. Architecture preserves its forms through such moments. Human lives dissolve into absence and contested memory. The palace remained. Rudolf was gone. The fresco above still depicted Habsburg virtue and divine sanction. The rooms below now contained a story of despair that no allegorical program had anticipated or could accommodate. By the summer of 1914, Franz Joseph had ruled for 66 years, making him one of Europe's longest reigning monarchs. He was 84 years old, his health declining, his daily routine at Schönbrunn maintained through sheer habit and the support of a staff familiar with his needs. The empire he governed had grown more fractious, its ethnic tensions between Germans and Czechs, Hungarians and Romanians, Croats and Serbs, increasingly difficult to manage through administrative centralization alone. Nationalist movements, socialist parties, and demands for greater political autonomy had transformed the Habsburg lands into a patchwork of competing loyalties, held together more by bureaucratic inertia and imperial tradition than by any shared sense of common purpose. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir who had inherited the succession after Rudolf's death, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. The news reached Schönbrunn by telegraph. Franz Joseph's response, recorded in diplomatic correspondence and later memoirs, was complex. Personal grief certainly, but also awareness of the political crisis the assassination would trigger. Within weeks, the intricate system of European alliances began to collapse into declarations of war. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized in Serbia's defense. Germany supported Austria-Hungary. France and Britain entered in support of Russia. By early August, the First World War had begun. Schönbrunn, during these war years, remained Franz Joseph's primary residence. He continued his routines, early rising, cold water washing, hours at his desk reviewing documents and signing orders. But the paperwork had changed. Where once he had reviewed administrative minutiae, appointments, budgets, ceremonial protocols, he now confronted casualty lists, mobilization plans, and diplomatic reports from a war that was consuming unprecedented numbers of lives. The palace that had been designed to embody peacetime grandeur now functioned as the administrative center of an empire at total war. The great gallery, its chandeliers now electrified and capable of extraordinary brightness, hosted diplomatic meetings and strategic conferences. Maps were spread across the same floors where court balls had once waltzed beneath Guglielmi's fresco. Officers in military uniform replaced courtiers in formal dress. The room's acoustic properties, designed for conversation and music, now carried discussions of troop movements, supply lines, and territorial objectives. Architecture, indifferent to use, accommodated war as easily as it had accommodated peace. Photographs from the period, preserved in Austrian military archives, show Franz Joseph at his desk in his private study at Schönbrunn. The room is spare: desk, chair, lamp, stacks of papers. The emperor appears shrunken, his white sideburns and military uniform formal, but his posture conveying exhaustion. In one widely reproduced image, he looks directly at the camera, his expression unreadable, neither defiant nor defeated, simply present. The photograph captures something essential about Schönbrunn during the war years, a building and a man both continuing to function past the point where function could alter outcomes. Franz Joseph's health deteriorated through 1916. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, exacerbated by his habit of keeping windows open even in cold weather and by his walks in the palace gardens. In November, he caught a cold during one of these walks. It worsened into pneumonia. By November 20th, his doctors recognized that he was dying. He remained in his narrow bed in his modest bedroom, surrounded by family members and court officials. Contemporary accounts describe his final hours in the restrained language of official bulletins. The emperor was conscious, aware of his condition, and accepted the rites of the Catholic Church. Franz Joseph died at Schönbrunn on the evening of November 21, 1916. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though his age and general frailty were contributing factors. News of his death was transmitted by telegraph to military commands and diplomatic missions across the empire and beyond. Newspapers, subject to wartime censorship, published carefully worded obituaries emphasizing his long service and devotion to duty. The palace where he was born and where he died became, in these accounts, inseparable from his identity. Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, died last night at Schönbrunn Castle, reported multiple European and American papers, the building's name signaling not just location, but symbolic weight. The funeral, held at the Hofburg and St. Stephen's Cathedral, was the last great Habsburg ceremonial performance. But Franz Joseph's death also marked a transition at Schönbrunn itself. The palace had been his primary residence for more than half a century. His daily routines had structured its use and atmosphere. With his death, the building entered a strange liminal state, still nominally an imperial residence. His successor, Emperor Karl the inherited the throne, but increasingly disconnected from the practical centers of wartime governance. Karl, 30 years old and untested, faced immediate military and political crises that left little time for the kind of ritualized court life Schönbrunn had been designed to host. The chandeliers in the Great Gallery, electrified and technically capable of spectacular illumination, were rarely lit during the final 2 years of the war. Energy and resources were diverted to military production. Public displays of wealth and light seemed inappropriate as casualty numbers climbed. The room that had once staged Habsburg grandeur now sat dark most evenings, its mirrors reflecting little, its fresco visible only in dim daylight, filtering through unwashed windows. The palace had not been physically damaged by war. No bombs had yet fallen on Vienna, but it was already experiencing a kind of functional obsolescence, its ceremonial spaces redundant in a world focused on survival rather than spectacle. Franz Joseph's bedroom, emptied of its occupant, was closed and would eventually be preserved as a memorial space. The narrow bed, the crucifix, the simple furniture, all remained as he had left them, artifacts of an emperor who had outlived his era. The room's simplicity, once a personal choice reflecting his ascetic temperament, now read differently, as evidence of a man and a dynasty running on diminishing returns, maintaining forms without the substance that had originally animated them. In the gardens, autumn leaves fell and were left where they lay, labor diverted elsewhere. The fountains which had run throughout Franz Joseph's reign were turned off to conserve water and coal. The gloriette on the hill, that Baroque monument to military victory, stood silent against the skyline, its colonnade framing a view over a city that was slowly starving under wartime privations. Schönbrunn, which had always required immense resources to maintain its appearance of effortless grandeur, was beginning to show what happens when those resources are withdrawn. Paint peeling, gardens overgrown, windows unwashed, silence replacing the orchestrated activity that had once defined the palace as a living institution. The empire that Franz Joseph had served for 66 years would outlast him by only 2 more, but the palace that had housed him would endure far longer, carrying his memory, and the memory of his dynasty, forward into a future where emperors would be museum exhibits rather than political actors. An emperor died in a modest room inside a palace designed for immortal display. The architecture preserved its forms. The political order those forms were meant to embody was already dissolving, its end coming not in sudden catastrophe, but in the slow unraveling of systems that could no longer adapt to the world they claimed to govern. On November 11, 1918, 2 years and 9 days after Franz Joseph's death, Emperor Karl Schönbrunn signed a document in Schönbrunn's Blue Chinese Salon that effectively ended Habsburg participation in Austrian governance. The text, carefully phrased by legal advisors, avoided the word abdication. Karl did not formally renounce his title, but declared that he would withdraw from state affairs and recognize whatever form of government the new Austrian Republic chose to establish. The following day, the Republic of German Austria was proclaimed. The empire that had employed Schönbrunn as its symbolic center for more than a century and a half had ceased to exist. The Blue Chinese Salon, where this signing took place, was one of Schönbrunn's most distinctive interior spaces. Its walls were covered with Chinese export wallpaper from the 18th century, depicting scenes of trade, crafts, and daily life in a style Europeans called chinoiserie. A romanticized, often inaccurate representation of Chinese culture filtered through European aesthetic preferences. The wallpaper's blues and whites, framed by painted floral swags, created an atmosphere of decorative exoticism that had been fashionable during Maria Theresa's reign. By 1918, the room felt like a relic from a different world, its aesthetic choices reflecting a cosmopolitanism that the nationalist movements now reshaping Central Europe explicitly rejected. Contemporary accounts, compiled from newspaper reports and later memoirs by participants, describe the scene. Karl seated at a desk, ministers and advisors standing nearby, the sound of voices low and controlled. Outside, in Vienna's streets, crowds gathered, their mood uncertain, some celebrating the end of monarchy, others anxious about what would follow. Inside the salon, the ceremony was brief. Karl signed, witnesses countersigned, the document was sealed. The parquet floor, its wood aged and polished by decades of foot traffic, absorbed the sound of chairs scraping as the meeting concluded. The empire that had commissioned Schönbrunn as a monument to dynastic permanence ended in a room whose wallpaper depicted Chinese artisans engaged in quiet, mundane tasks, an accidental but revealing irony. Empress Zita, Karl's wife, later recalled in exile that she had never felt comfortable in the Blue Chinese Salon, finding its decoration too deliberate, too staged. The comment, recorded in a 1950s interview, suggests something important about how the last imperial residents experienced Schönbrunn. Not as a living home, but as a museum they were obliged to inhabit, its rooms filled with aesthetic choices made by long-dead predecessors. Karl and Zita had moved into Schönbrunn after Franz Joseph's death, occupying apartments that still bore the imprint of his preferences and routines. They had attempted to modernize some spaces, but the overall effect remained one of overwhelming historical weight, every room a reminder of the dynasty they represented and the expectations they were failing to meet. Karl and Zita left Schönbrunn in November 1918 and never returned. They initially moved to Schloss Eckartsau, a smaller hunting lodge east of Vienna, before being forced into exile in Switzerland in early 1919. Karl died in 1922 at age 34 on the Portuguese island of Madeira, his 2 brief restoration attempts in Hungary having failed. Zita lived until 1989, spending decades in exile, never accepting the loss of the empire and never seeing Schönbrunn again except in photographs and memory. The palace that had been the family's most visible symbol of authority became, in their absence, a structure whose meaning had to be entirely reconstituted. The new Austrian Republic inherited Schönbrunn as state property. The palace's immediate future was uncertain. Some voices called for its demolition or conversion to alternative uses, a proposal that gained little traction but revealed how contested the building's meaning had become. Was Schönbrunn a national treasure, an artifact of architectural and cultural significance? Or was it a monument to an oppressive monarchical system that the Republic had rightly replaced? The debate, conducted in newspapers and parliamentary discussions, reflected broader uncertainties about how the new Austria should relate to its Habsburg past. Pragmatism eventually prevailed. Schönbrunn was too valuable as a potential tourist attraction and too historically significant to destroy. Beginning in the early 1920s, portions of the palace were open to public tours. The state apartments, the Great Gallery, the Hall of Mirrors, the Hall of Ceremonies, and selected residential rooms were preserved as museum spaces, their furnishings stabilized and their decorative programs maintained. Visitor guidebooks from the period emphasized historic interiors, and the rooms of Maria Theresa and Franz Joseph, framing the palace as heritage rather than political symbol. The Blue Chinese Salon, where Karl had signed away Habsburg authority, became another stop on the tour route, its wallpaper and furnishings carefully labeled and explained. The gardens, which had been open to limited public access in the late 18th century, became more firmly established as a recreational space for Vienna's residents. On weekends, families walked the allées, children played near the fountains, and vendors sold refreshments. The garden's formal geometry remained, but their use had democratized. The landscape that had once served as a designed extension of imperial power was now simply a park, beautiful, historically significant, but no longer coded as exclusive or politically charged. During the 1920s and 1930s, Schönbrunn existed in a kind of suspended state. It was no longer a living imperial residence, but not yet fully transformed into the heritage site it would become after 1945. Maintenance budgets were limited. Some rooms fell into disrepair. Photographs from the period show peeling paint, tarnished gilding, and windows with broken panes. The Great Gallery's chandeliers, which had been electrified in 1901, still hung but were lit only for special occasions, concerts, diplomatic receptions hosted by the Republic, their brilliance now rationed rather than routine. The palace's political meaning shifted with Austria's own political transformations. The Austro-fascist regime, established in the 1930s under Engelbert Dollfuss and Kurt Schuschnigg, sought to create an authoritarian Catholic state distinct from both liberal democracy and Nazi Germany. Schönbrunn, with its Habsburg associations, became useful as a symbol of Austrian identity rooted in imperial tradition rather than German nationalism. Ceremonies and events were staged at the palace, leveraging its architectural grandeur to legitimize the regime's claim to represent historical continuity. After the Anschluss in March 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria, Schönbrunn's symbolism shifted again. The Nazis were ideologically hostile to the Habsburg monarchy, viewing it as multinational and therefore antithetical to their racial nationalism. Yet they also recognized Schönbrunn's architectural value and its utility as a backdrop for state events. The palace was maintained, its rooms used for receptions and exhibitions, but its Habsburg associations were downplayed or reinterpreted through Nazi ideological lenses. What this succession of regimes reveals is architecture's fundamental adaptability. Schönbrunn's physical form, its Baroque proportions, its Rococo interiors, its gilded chandeliers, remained constant even as the political systems using it changed radically. The palace could serve monarchy, republic, authoritarian dictatorship, and Nazi occupation with equal facility, its spaces flexible enough to accommodate any authority willing to maintain them. This flexibility, which might seem like resilience, also marked a kind of ideological emptiness. Schönbrunn meant whatever its current occupants needed it to mean, its original symbolic program overwhelmed by the weight of historical accumulation. The chandeliers in the Great Gallery still hung, their arms frozen in Baroque exuberance, their light controlled by electrical switches rather than candle flames. They had survived the end of the empire. They were about to face a test architecture had not anticipated, the sustained aerial bombing of modern total war. The Second World War brought sustained violence to Vienna for the first time since the Ottoman sieges of the 16th and 17th centuries. Beginning in 1943, Allied bombing raids targeted the city's industrial areas, rail yards, and strategic infrastructure. Schönbrunn, located on Vienna's western edge near rail lines and military facilities, was not immune. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 270 bombs fell within the palace grounds, damaging multiple buildings and coming terrifyingly close to destroying the main palace structure itself. The Gardetract, or guards wing, near the palace's main entrance, was hit directly and largely destroyed. Period photographs taken immediately after the raids show collapsed walls, exposed interiors, and rubble scattered across the forecourt. The Cavalier wing and several ancillary buildings suffered heavy damage. The Gloriette, the Baroque monument crowning the hill above the gardens, was struck on its left side. The colonnade partially collapsed, leaving a jagged gap against the skyline. The gardens themselves, meticulously maintained geometric parterres and allées, were scarred by craters and littered with debris. The main palace survived, but narrowly. In February 1945, a bomb penetrated 2 floors of the building, crashing through the roof, the attic, and the ceiling of the Great Gallery, before lodging between the floor above and Guglielmi's 1760 fresco below. The bomb did not explode. If it had, the Great Gallery would have been devastated, the ceiling fresco destroyed, the Rococo stucco obliterated, the chandeliers torn from their mountings, the mirrors shattered, and the structural integrity of the central wing compromised. Instead, the bomb simply stopped, wedged in place, its explosive payload intact, its presence a lethal possibility that had to be carefully removed by military ordnance teams after the city's liberation. Even without exploding, the bomb's impact caused significant damage. The eastern portion of the Great Gallery's fresco, which depicted an allegory of Austria's military might, was destroyed. Plaster collapsed, painted surface fragmented, the iconography of invincible Habsburg arms literally torn apart by an instrument of modern war. The irony was noted years later by art historians examining war damage reports. The section of the ceiling that celebrated 18th century military victories was erased by 20th century military technology. The other portions of the fresco, the central section showing Maria Theresa and Franz Stephan enthroned, and the western allegories, survived, though covered in dust and plaster fragments. The chandeliers, remarkably, remained intact. Photographs taken shortly after the raid show them hanging at slight angles, coated in debris, but structurally sound. Their gilded wood arms, which had held candles in the 18th century and electric bulbs since 1901, had survived the concussion of the bomb's impact. The engineering that had lifted them into place nearly 2 centuries earlier, iron chains, secure mounting points in the ceiling structure, proved more durable than the political order they had been designed to illuminate. In the aftermath of the February 1945 raid, the Great Gallery was silent and dark. Dust hung in the air, visible in the pale light filtering through windows that had, against all odds, not shattered. The polished parquet floor was covered in plaster chunks, paint flakes, and the fine white powder of pulverized Rococo stucco. The room that had once been the palace's ceremonial heart, the space where Habsburg power had staged its most elaborate performances, was now a ruin, functional enough to reveal what it had been, damaged enough to make clear how close it had come to total obliteration. The war ended in May 1945 with Vienna under Soviet control, soon to be divided into occupation zones, administered by the 4 Allied powers. Schönbrunn, located in the British sector, became a British military headquarters. Photographs from the immediate post-war period show British armored vehicles parked in the forecourt, soldiers walking through the gardens, and command structures established in palace rooms that had once hosted Habsburg court functions. The juxtaposition of 20th century military hardware and Baroque architecture created surreal visual contrasts: tanks beside Rococo fountains, uniformed soldiers beneath gilded stucco, radio antennas extending from yellow stuccoed wings. Restoration began almost immediately, driven by Austrian cultural authorities and supported by British occupation officials who recognized the palace's historical value. The Great Gallery's damaged fresco section was carefully documented through photographs and written descriptions. Between 1947 and 1948, Austrian painters, working from these records and from surviving preparatory sketches found in archives, reconstructed the destroyed Eastern allegory. The work aimed for faithful reproduction rather than creative reinterpretation, The goal was to make the repair invisible, to restore the fresco to its pre-1945 appearance. The reconstruction succeeded well enough that today, without specific guidance, most visitors cannot identify which section of the ceiling was rebuilt. The chandeliers were cleaned, their gilding restored where damaged, and rehung in their original positions. The floor was repaired, new parquet laid where old wood had been destroyed. The mirrors, most of which had survived, were polished. The stucco was patched, repainted, and regiled. By the early 1950s, the Great Gallery looked, from ground level, much as it had before the war, a testament to restoration skills, but also to the palace's architectural resilience and the determination to preserve it as a cultural symbol for post-imperial, post-war Austria. Yet, something had fundamentally changed. The bomb that failed to explode had nonetheless shattered an illusion that the palace's stone and stucco had always suggested, that architecture, by virtue of scale and aesthetic ambition, could transcend history. Schönbrunn had been built to embody permanence. The bomb proved that permanence was contingent, maintained only through luck and the failure of explosive devices to function as designed. The palace survived, but its survival felt less like invulnerability and more like narrow escape. The Gloriette, partially destroyed, was restored in phases over several decades. The garde-tract and damaged wings were rebuilt. The gardens were replanted, their parterres returned to geometric precision. By the 1960s, Schönbrunn had regained a coherent visual appearance, its war damage erased from the landscape. But photographs taken during the restoration years remain in Austrian archives, images of rubble, exposed interiors, and gaping holes in Baroque facades, evidence that even the most carefully constructed monuments remain vulnerable to forces their builders could not have anticipated. The silence after the bomb's impact, that moment when dust hung in the Great Gallery and the chandeliers swung slightly on their chains, marked a caesura in Schönbrunn's history. The palace that had survived regime changes and political upheavals without physical alteration had finally been struck. It survived that strike through accident rather than design. In the decades that followed, as Schönbrunn was restored and repurposed as a tourist destination and heritage site, this wartime damage would be minimized in official narratives, a brief interruption in an otherwise continuous story. But for anyone examining the historical record closely, the bomb lodged between fresco and floor remains a pivotal moment, the instant when Schönbrunn's claim to architectural permanence was physically tested and found wanting, preserved only by the malfunction of a weapon designed to erase buildings from existence. In the decade following the war's end, Schönbrunn's identity underwent its most fundamental transformation, from imperial residence to heritage site, from living political symbol to curated historical artifact. The physical restoration, as described, returned the palace to visual coherence. But the more difficult work was conceptual, determining what Schönbrunn should mean in a democratic Austria that had definitively rejected monarchy, survived Nazi occupation, and was now navigating Cold War neutrality while rebuilding from wartime devastation. In 1955, the Austrian State Treaty formally ended Allied occupation and restored full sovereignty to Austria. The treaty negotiations were conducted partly at Schönbrunn, in rooms whose Baroque proportions and Rococo ornament provided a setting that was both neutral, no longer Habsburg or Nazi, simply Austrian, and symbolically weighty. The palace's capacity to absorb and reframe political meaning proved useful. It could host Cold War diplomacy precisely because its original symbolic program was now safely historical, irrelevant to contemporary power struggles. Schönbrunn had become a backdrop, its architecture providing aesthetic gravitas without political content. The palace's management was formalized through a series of administrative decisions in the late 1950s and early 1960s. State apartments were systematically restored and opened to public tours. Furnishings were stabilized, textiles conserved, wall coverings repaired. The Great Gallery resumed limited ceremonial use, state receptions, occasional concerts, but its primary function was now as museum space, its history narrated through guided tours and printed materials. The chandeliers, refurbished after the war, were displayed as artifacts of Baroque craftsmanship, their original function as instruments of imperial spectacle translated into heritage discourse. In 1961, Schönbrunn hosted one of the Cold War's most photographed diplomatic encounters, the summit meeting between U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The meeting, held in June shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion and amid rising tensions over Berlin, was intended as an opportunity for the two leaders to assess each other personally. Photographs from the event show Kennedy and Khrushchev seated in the Great Gallery, surrounded by advisors, the room's Baroque splendor providing a visually rich background for international news coverage. The summit itself achieved little concrete diplomatic progress, but the images of Kennedy and Khrushchev at Schönbrunn circulated globally, cementing the palace's new role as a site of international significance detached from Habsburg history. The room, designed to glorify Maria Theresa, now hosted Cold War adversaries negotiating nuclear policy. The chandeliers, visible in the background of news photographs, hung above discussions of missile deployment and spheres of influence, topics that would have been incomprehensible to the room's original builders, but which the room accommodated with the same spatial flexibility it had shown throughout its history. During this period, Schönbrunn also became a locus of what cultural critics and Habsburg historians have called nostalgia and almost cultic reverence of the imperial past, as Cold War Austria sought to define a national identity distinct from both German nationalism and Habsburg imperialism. Popular culture increasingly romanticized the monarchy, particularly the figures of Maria Theresa, Franz Joseph, and Empress Elizabeth Sisi. Films, operettas, and eventually television series depicted an idealized Habsburg world of elegant balls, devoted emperors, and tragic empresses, a version of history that minimized political oppression, ethnic tensions, and social inequality in favor of aesthetic beauty and personal drama. Schönbrunn became central to this cultural project. Visitor numbers climbed steadily through the 1960s and 1970s, reaching into the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions annually. Guided tours emphasized personal anecdotes and architectural splendor over political history. The narrative presented to tourists often centered on individual Habsburgs, Maria Theresa's large family, Franz Joseph's long reign, Sisi's beauty and tragic wandering, rather than on the structural dynamics of imperial governance or the reasons the empire collapsed. The palace became a stage for historical memory selectively curated to emphasize grandeur and tragedy while downplaying violence and exploitation. This selective memory was not unique to Schönbrunn. It characterized Austria's broader relationship to its Habsburg past in the post-war decades. But the palace's physical presence, its Baroque proportions, its Rococo interiors, its sheer aesthetic impact, made abstract nostalgia concrete. To walk through the Great Gallery was to feel, however briefly, the seductive power of architectural grandeur, to experience physically what it meant to inhabit spaces designed to overwhelm and impress. That this experience was now available for a ticket price rather than by birth or appointment represented a democratization of access, but it also transformed the palace from political instrument to consumer good, its history commodified into a tourist attraction. The chandeliers in this context acquired additional layers of meaning. Originally designed to impress courtiers and foreign dignitaries with Habsburg wealth and taste, they now impress tourists with Austria's cultural heritage. Technically updated again in later decades, the electric bulbs of the 1950s eventually replaced with LED lights designed to mimic candle flame. The chandeliers became hybrid objects, authentic Baroque structures fitted with contemporary technology, historical artifacts still performing their original function of illuminating the room, but now for cameras rather than court ceremonies. Photographs from the 1960s and 1970s show the Great Gallery in this transitional state, tourists standing on the parquet floor that had once supported waltzing Habsburgs, looking up at a fresco that depicted a political order no longer existing, beneath chandeliers that had been materially updated but visually preserved. The room functioned as a time capsule and a working space simultaneously, museum and event venue, historical artifact and contemporary utility. This duality would intensify in subsequent decades as Schönbrunn's management became more sophisticated and its global visibility increased. By the 1980s, Schönbrunn was firmly established as one of Austria's most important cultural sites. Annual visitor numbers approached 3 million for the palace and gardens combined. The economic implications were clear. Heritage tourism generated revenue that supported conservation, making Schönbrunn financially sustainable in ways that state subsidy alone could not achieve. This economic logic would shape the palace's future, eventually leading to the 1992 creation of Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebs GmbH, a company wholly owned by the Republic of Austria, but operated as a commercial enterprise tasked with both preserving the palace and generating income through tourism. The palace that had been built to display Habsburg wealth now generated wealth for the Austrian state through the display of its own history. This transformation, from active political symbol to heritage commodity, marks one of Schönbrunn's most significant post-imperial shifts. The Great Gallery's chandeliers, lit for evening events and tours, no longer proclaimed dynastic power. They proclaimed Austria's capacity to maintain and profit from the architectural remnants of that power. The palace survived by becoming something other than itself, by accepting that survival in the post-imperial age required adaptability to market forces and tourist expectations rather than to dynastic protocols. In 1996, the palace and gardens of Schönbrunn were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, recognized as a remarkable Baroque ensemble and a perfect example of Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art. The designation acknowledged not only the palace itself, but the comprehensive landscape, formal gardens, fountains, the Gloriette, the Palm House, the Tiergarten Zoo, founded in 1752 and therefore the world's oldest continuously operating zoo, and the intricate hydraulic and horticultural systems that sustained them. UNESCO's criteria emphasize Schönbrunn's outstanding universal value, a phrase that performed significant ideological work by translating what was originally an expression of Habsburg dynastic ego into a shared global heritage. The UNESCO inscription had practical consequences. It brought international prestige, increased tourist traffic, and imposed conservation obligations that required Austria to maintain the site according to specific standards. But it also completed a process begun in 1918, the definitive separation of Schönbrunn from any particular political order and its recategorization as a site belonging, in some abstract sense, to humanity, rather than to Austria, the Habsburgs, or any single cultural tradition. The palace, built to mark difference in hierarchy, was now framed as a universal treasure, accessible to anyone with a ticket and an interest in architectural history. The language UNESCO used in its inscription is revealing. Terms like remarkable ensemble, perfect example, and outstanding universal value naturalize aesthetic judgments as objective facts. They suggest that Schönbrunn's significance is self-evident, inscribed in the stones and stucco themselves, rather than constructed through historical processes that privileged certain aesthetic traditions and political narratives over others. A palace built through the labor of thousands of workers whose names do not appear in any archive, financed through tax systems that extracted wealth from Habsburg territories, and designed explicitly to legitimize dynastic rule, is now celebrated for its beauty and cultural importance without sustained attention to the power relations its beauty was designed to encode. Yet UNESCO designation also secured Schönbrunn's preservation. Without international recognition and the tourism revenue it generated, maintaining a complex of over 1,400 rooms, extensive gardens, and multiple ancillary buildings would strain any national budget. By 1996, Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebs GmbH, established in 1992, was managing the site as a commercial operation. Ticket sales, events, and merchandise generated sufficient income to fund ongoing conservation. This economic model, heritage site as revenue-generating enterprise, has since been replicated at cultural sites worldwide, but Schönbrunn was among the first major European palaces to embrace it systematically. The Great Gallery's chandeliers, painstakingly restored between 2010 and 2012, exemplify this preservation approach. The restoration, funded through operational revenue rather than direct state subsidy, involved specialists in historical carpentry, gilding, and electrical engineering. Each chandelier was carefully lowered, photographed, and documented. The original carved wood structures, dating from the 1760s, were cleaned and repaired. Gilding was touched up using traditional techniques. The electrical systems, added in 1901 and updated several times since, were completely replaced with LED technology designed to mimic the warm, flickering quality of candlelight. The restoration cost hundreds of thousands of euros per chandelier, but the investment was justified economically. The chandeliers are among Schönbrunn's most photographed elements, their image appearing in countless tourist brochures, social media posts, and promotional materials. The restored chandeliers hang in the Great Gallery today, much as they did in the 18th century, visually identical to their original form, yet materially different. LED lights simulate candle flame. Digital controls manage brightness and timing. Modern electrical systems hidden above the Baroque ceiling plaster allow the room to be lit instantly, rather than requiring servants to light hundreds of individual candles over the course of an hour. This technical modernization, invisible to most visitors, represents the compromise heritage sites must make, preserving appearance while updating function, maintaining historical aesthetics through contemporary means. Annual visitor numbers for Schönbrunn now exceed 3 million for the palace itself, and many more for the gardens and zoo, making it Austria's most visited cultural site. These visitors, arriving from dozens of countries and speaking dozens of languages, experience Schönbrunn through the mediation of tours, audio guides, information panels, and the increasingly ubiquitous smartphone cameras that have replaced period paintings as the primary mode of capturing and circulating images of the palace. To visit Schönbrunn today is to navigate crowds, queues, designated photo spots, and souvenir shops, a commercialized encounter with history that would be unrecognizable to the palace's original inhabitants, but which now constitutes its primary mode of existence. The Great Gallery, when not closed for private events, is open to tourists who walk its length, cameras raised, documenting their presence beneath Guglielmi's fresco and the glittering chandeliers. The room's acoustics, designed for conversation and music, now amplify the constant murmur of guided tours in multiple languages, the clicking of camera shutters, and the shuffling of feet. The parquet floor, which once supported waltzing court dancers, now bears the daily traffic of thousands of visitors whose shoes wear microscopic grooves into wood that must be periodically replaced, plank by plank, following historical patterns and traditional techniques. This democratization of access represents one possible interpretation of Schönbrunn's post-imperial evolution. A building that once excluded most of humanity now welcomes it, at least those who can afford admission. Yet, access is still mediated, controlled, and commodified. Visitors see what the palace management chooses to show, narrated through interpretive materials that emphasize certain histories and minimize others. The labor that built and maintained Schönbrunn, stonemasons, gilders, gardeners, servants, remains largely invisible in official narratives, which focus on emperors, empresses, architects, and artists. The global economic structures that allowed 18th-century Habsburg Austria to accumulate the wealth necessary to build such a palace, colonial exploitation, territorial extraction, trade imbalances, receive little attention in museum text panels that prefer to celebrate aesthetic achievement and cultural significance. Schönbrunn has thus moved through three distinct phases: imperial residence, 1696-1918, state property and museum, 1918-1990s, and heritage commodity, 1990s present. In each phase, the physical structure remained largely constant, same walls, same proportions, same decorative programs, but its meaning and use transformed completely. The palace that once embodied Habsburg power now generates income for the Austrian state by displaying the aesthetic remains of that power to global tourists. The Great Gallery that once hosted court balls now hosts ticketed concerts marketed as authentic historical experiences, their programs carefully curated to balance cultural legitimacy with commercial appeal. The chandeliers, lit for these evening concerts, cast LED light that closely mimics candlelight across a room full of contemporary tourists, dressed in modern clothing, seated in rented chairs, listening to period music performed on historical instruments. The experience is simultaneously authentic. The room, fresco, and chandeliers are genuine Baroque artifacts, and entirely constructed, a heritage performance designed to generate revenue while creating the impression of unmediated access to historical experience. That these contradictions go largely unexamined in the experience itself is typical of heritage tourism. The focus remains on aesthetic pleasure and the consumption of historical atmospheres, rather than critical engagement with the political and economic structures that created the sites being consumed.